Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're enjoying General Conference and the hours of binge watching that we always do on this weekend. Today's is going to be a little bit more of a lighthearted musing rather than a deeper doctrinal one. And going through just a list of, you might call it, old man yelling at cloud or silly things that some of them are less silly. Some of them are a little more substantive, but so much of what I find interesting about these things that I talk about is kind of the connection between culture and doctrine, and the way that we encumber our church worship and practice and experience and community with all these things that kind of, first they're traditions and they're rules. Sometimes they work their way into the handbook, and I just find this very interesting how we as a people kind of, I don't know, in any social community you have these types of things emerge, so we're not unique in that regard. But I want to go over some that I think are perhaps more unique to us. So the first one is using middle names, or more particularly middle initials, for church leaders. This very formal, almost legalistic use of people's middle names. I guarantee you 90% of these people, probably 99% of these people, never used their middle name in their professional and personal life. But suddenly when they're called to be a church leader, that middle name, it's like for me, Connor S. Boyack, that doesn't make any sense. I never go by that. It's, without reason. So a little bit of backdrop to this. In the early days of the church, this wasn't really done for a couple of reasons. First is, at the time in America, middle names weren't really a thing. A lot of early church leaders, like many Americans at the time, didn't even have middle names. The second aspect to this is that the early church members referred to their leaders in informal names, and so you had things like Brother Brigham, Brother Smith, Brother Joseph. And it was a much more endearing, informal approach to referring to people. But then over time, the church members started shifting to last names instead. And then all of a sudden you had the middle initials creeping in. Now, initially, I think, at least there's an argument to be made that it helped distinguish people. So, we had Joseph Smith, but then we had Joseph F. Smith, and then we had Joseph Fielding Smith. And so clearly where you need to distinguish, then that makes a little bit of sense. I found this on LDS Living, though. So in April 1880, this was the first official conference report that we had. Only 10 out of the 31 speakers had a middle name or initial. So that's about 32% back in 1880. And then you fast forward a couple decades, and then 23 of 37 speakers had a middle name or initial. So it went from 32% to 62% between 1880 and 1897. And then we get to April 1914, and every single leader except for one had a middle initial. And since 1914, if the individual had a middle name, they used a middle initial. And so I just think, if I was ever called to be a general authority, which I, don't see ever happening, thankfully, I would basically insist that I not be referred to as Connor S. Boyack. There's no doctrinal or theological reason here. This is a very, in my opinion, kind of silly tradition that we do to be so kind of formal. I would much prefer to say Brother Holland or Elder Holland than Jeffrey R. Holland, or, just call him Jeffrey Holland if you need to refer to his full name. Okay, so that's one. Another one that I find kind of silly is how poorly a lot of our testimony meetings are, and how little testifying there actually is. I'm referring in particular to the travel log testimonies, where people get up and just share these long, protracted stories about, where they went and the circumstances that happened and what went on. And look, that context is completely appropriate, I think, when it is a quick kind of lead-in to the focus of the testimony and the testifying, to be able to draw upon a story for a specific observation, epiphany, inspiration, principle, whatever. But too often, these testimonies, if you can even call that, kind of meander down these paths of I don't know, theological irrelevance, because people are just talking and filling space and sharing the travel log. And I've gosh, can't remember how many different wards I've been in over the years for fast and testimony meeting, and this is a very consistent thing across location and age and demographics. So that to me is another silly one. Another one is face cards. This is so interesting, right? Because I, enjoy a good game of solitaire or Texas Hold'em or whatever, right? And I remember growing up how there was like this like whispering of like, oh, you're unrighteous if you do that. And church leaders have said, don't do that. And you're a rebel, you're a Jack Mormon or whatever if you use face cards. I'm like, where does this come from? Well, if we go clear back to Brigham Young, he said, card playing and all other games of chance should be avoided as the gate of destruction. He loved his very declarative, bold statements without nuance. But we can at least make sense of this in part, I think, because at the time, playing cards were associated very strongly with gambling and saloons and casinos. And these types of face cards were not so much used for like familial recreation and just lighthearted games, or if you've ever played Nerds, that isn't very lighthearted. At least my wife and I had to stop playing Nerds years ago because she got so upset with me when I started to be able to beat her, and she's very competitive. So the Nerds went out the window. It's not always lighthearted, but it often is. And yet at the time, early on in the church, it wasn't really a family kind of fun, benign experience. It was this kind of close association. And so it seems to be that the church leaders who were commenting on face cards and planted these cultural seeds, these traditions in our culture, had that association in mind. So effectively, it's guilt by association. The cards themselves were not the problem. It's what the cards would lead to. And therefore, instead of just focusing on that end action on its own and saying, don't do that, they kind of went upstream. And so the cards are the gate of destruction. So don't play cards, even though card playing itself is, I don't think problematic. So President Joseph F. Smith, middle initial, in General Conference one time, he listed playing cards as a crime along with visiting saloons and gambling. So he said this: while a simple game of cards in itself may be harmless, it is a fact that by immoderate repetition, in other words, frequent repetition, it ends in an infatuation for chance schemes, in habits of excess, in waste of precious time, in dulling and stupor of the mind, and in complete destruction of religious feeling. There is the grave danger that lurks in persistent card playing, which begets the spirit of gambling, of speculation, and that awakens the dangerous desire to get something for nothing. So again, it's like it's worried about the slippery slope more than anything. Heber J. Grant in 1926 told church members to, quote, let cards alone. Joseph Fielding Smith wrote that it's a habit that cannot too severely be condemned. And then finally, I wrote this down this is apparently the most recent time that a church leader has spoken out about face cards. It was, 49 years ago, 1974, from Spencer W. Kimball, where he told members, we hope faithful Latter-day Saints will not use the playing cards, which are used for gambling either with or without the gambling. So whether you're gambling or not, stay away from face cards. So for me, I was born in 1981, just 7 years after this was passed. And then as I'm a kid and a teenager, there was just, again, this like it's taboo. Stay away from the playing cards. And I just think that is a silly tradition in the sense that it's okay to address the actual problem and stay away from that. But we, I think, need to disconnect the upstream activities that can themselves be totally fine and even enjoyable and don't lead down that path. Getting upstream too much and saying we're going to shut down all these other activities because they might lead towards that other thing. It's guilt by association. I think, from my perspective, it's not appropriate. And I don't think there's anything wrong with playing face cards. The fact that we haven't heard about it in a half a century, I think, lends to that. And this is part of the challenge too. This was such a more heavily ingrained attitude or perspective. And so what happens is all these seeds get planted of this cultural influence and these traditions because of what church leaders decades and decades ago said in a different time. So then culture changes in our society or whatever, or we learn more, or we change our behaviors, but all those statements are still there. And so maybe today church leaders don't feel like face cards are inherently problematic or that they're the gate of destruction because there are so many just benign recreational uses of the cards. And yet no one is correcting the record. No church leader is saying, oh, all those things don't apply anymore, right? There's been no new inspiration or revelation on the matter. And so what we have controls, what we, past counsel controls until it's superseded. That's our cultural understanding of the prophetic and revelatory role. And yet nothing has been superseded. And so we have all that stuff and saying don't use it. And now it's kind of this tradition that people do or don't follow based on how faithful they want to be to stuff that was said decades ago but hasn't been talked about in the past half a century. So I think that's a silly one. Another one that I can't stand, oh my gosh, is... And I've seen this in a lot of words, but I don't have the biggest sample here. And yet when I talk to people about this, they say it's happening in their congregations too. And that is, someone gets up to give a talk, and the first 30 seconds is self-deprecation, right? It's the story about how they got the call from the counselor, and they were trying to ignore the call, but they showed up at their door, and I was caught, and I'm no good at public speaking. So I wrote this last night, and here we go. And over again, these people self-deprecate. I believe, I don't know if this has ever happened in your ward. When I was growing up in my ward, they would adjourn the sacrament meeting. They would dismiss all the teachers to go get ready for class. And in the 5 to 10 minutes while they were kind of waiting in transition before they let everybody go, was it the choir director or whoever it was, the ward music leader, they would basically do musical instruction. And they would take some time with the ward to kind of say, okay, here's how we can better harmonize, or here's where you should, not get tripped up with this hymn we, sing, or let's sing a new hymn we haven't sung in a long time, and let's take the time to kind of practice it. So if we sing this in a few weeks, no one will feel embarrassed or weird about it. And I thought that was kind of cool. I haven't experienced that in any other ward, but this more instruction-focused effort to help educate members. So I think we need something similar for public speaking. We, I don't know, I guess people assume, people do it since the time they're in primary and they've had all this speaking experience. And yet I think in our church, generally, we're very poor at it. I think we need to knock off the self-deprecation. I think we need not tell the story of how we were asked. Just go into your talk, right? It's when you're So I have a speaking coach, actually, and lots of great advice. This guy's amazing. But one of the biggest things that has stuck in my mind since I've been working with him is when you're speaking, it's never about you. It's always about the audience. And so when you get up there and you start, I felt this and I don't like that and I'm not good at this, nobody cares, right? We're sitting there listening to that, and it's awkward and stupid and it's a waste of time, and it distracts or detracts from the spirit. And so you need to focus on the audience. Just get into the content and share uplifting, edifying content to build our testimonies. That's why we speak. And I think church members need a speaking coach. I think we need public speaking lessons, because to me, it totally detracts from the spirit when we do some of this stuff. All right, next one. Caffeine. Oh gosh, this one is, I don't need to belabor the point. We all kind of know how weird this one is, that there have long been members of the church who feel like, soda with caffeine is against the word of wisdom because of habit-forming substances. I've got all kinds of quotes here that I could get into. Maybe I'll just share one or two. In 1937, Elder John A. Widsoe, again, middle initial A, so important. Elder Widsoe and his wife Leah wrote the first major book on the word of wisdom. And they spoke out in that book very strongly against caffeine. They said, whenever a drink is advertised to give you a lift, the lift is likely to be caused by the drug which it contains. Such soft drinks are decidedly harmful and habit-forming, even though sold by the millions. Such caffeine-containing drinks, offered by every soda fountain and most eating places, and consumed in large quantities, should be known and avoided. Of course, then by contrast, you have David O. McKay, who a few decades later, he was like at the theater, and there was an employee who gave him a cup with a Coca-Cola logo. And that employee went up to, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. And he said, I don't care what it says on the cup as long as there is a Coke in the cup. So it's nice at least to see, I think he was also the one where he was served rum cake. And again, they kind of freaked out. Oh my gosh, we just gave President McKay, rum cake. And they went up to apologize. And he's like, the word of wisdom says nothing about eating alcohol. It just says don't drink it. So anyways, so there's kind of a spectrum here on this issue of caffeine. Of course, we have Elder Uchtdorf, who in 2016 joked that he was transitioning into becoming apostle with the help of, quote, many liters of a diet soda that shall remain nameless. But the very fact that he had to say it, that, like, everyone laughed, right? Because it's like, us Mormons and our Diet Coke addictions, and somehow that's better than, Starbucks addictions. So the fact that everyone's kind of ha about it, and the fact that he said that at all and framed it that way, shows this tradition, this kind of misunderstanding, I think, about what the word of wisdom actually says. And we get into these like tangential interpretations and these, broader things. Boyd Packer in 1996 said, there are many habit-forming addictive things that one can drink or chew or inhale or inject, which injure both body and spirit, which are not mentioned in the word of wisdom. Obedience to counsel will keep you on the safe side of life. So he's inferring that not only should you stay away from caffeine, but anything else that's, addictive or habit-forming. He's talking more about the spirit of the law than the letter of the law, but one could also argue that the spirit of the law doesn't even say anything necessarily about so-called habit-forming things, and that caffeine isn't actually necessarily, habit-forming or doesn't necessarily lead down that path. We could talk about sugar, how addictive sugar is. I mean, I'm a sugar addict. I love eating sweet things, and so imagine if church leaders were to condemn sugar. All these, So Delicious and swig shops are a testament to the fact that we as church members, have kind of loosened up on this caffeine thing, not so much the sugar thing. But to me, that's kind of a weird area of confusion in the church, and all these kind of odd traditions that have stemmed around it. And at BYU, right, for the longest time, they wouldn't sell caffeinated drinks because somehow we're more holy when we're on BYU, and we gotta, rise above the worldly habit-forming caffeine. I don't know. Next one. So I did a musing on this last one, the word of wisdom. So you can go to sundaymusings.org. And in the drop-down, go to Word of Wisdom, and you'll find that one. This next one I also did a separate musing on, so we won't spend too much time on it. But it is a silly tradition, and that has to do with facial hair and church leaders. So that musing was done some months ago when, in our ward, a new bishop was called who had an amazing beard, and the stake president made him shave it off. And how ridiculous that is. I mean, Jesus had a beard. Presumably a bunch of the apostles had a beard. Early church leaders had a beard. And as I mentioned in that musing, part of this cultural tradition that has seeped into our church is from the association with, decades ago with like the hippies and being unkempt and whatever. And so you have some of those church leaders who said things that have not been overturned. Here's another example where stake presidents today are basing their actions on things that were said decades ago that are no longer relevant in our so-called modern society, and yet no church leaders have said anything to overturn or correct or refute or contextualize those past statements. So then you get church leaders who still act on them, even though they're decades old and I think shouldn't have been necessarily said to begin with at all. And so then you got people who have amazing beards like my neighbor bishop who have to shave. And of course, he's not the only one. This happens a lot. And I think it's all silly. All right, another one. Why do Sunday school presidencies have to be men? So this is not only a tradition. This is actually in the handbook. This is kind of elevated its way into the handbook, where it says that the bishop calls and sets apart a Melchizedek priesthood holder to be the ward Sunday school president. And then if counselors are needed, and if there are enough men to serve in these positions, the Sunday school president may recommend one or two counselors. So I've been in Sunday school presidencies at the ward level, at the stake level. I've been a gospel doctrine teacher for, lots of years, working under or with Sunday school presidencies. I see zero reason why we need this to be priesthood holders. Now, I totally get that we don't want to have mixed gender presidencies and have like a Sunday school president who's a dude, and then he calls two counselors who are women. Like, that obviously doesn't make sense. But I see no reason why we can't have in any given ward either all women Sunday school presidency or an all men. There's nothing particular about that role that requires having priesthood authority or anything like that. It's not a function of the priesthood. The Sunday school was an auxiliary organization in the early church that was kind of independent, doing its own thing, had its own leaders, created its own curriculum. And then, of course, through correlation in the 60s and 70s, the Sunday school was brought underneath the priesthood in terms of authority and oversight and control. But it's just Sunday school. It's just teachers. And I will say, I think, having been in Sunday school presidencies, I think women would do a far superior job. I mean, I've been in wards where, January comes or whatever, and they have to change all the classes around, especially for the kids, right? Okay, you're this age, and whatever, right? Like, men are far less organized on stuff like this and prepared and diligent, and then you look at the primary where the women in charge, and they've already got it all printed out, and they've got it to the parents, and the kids know for primary right where they're going, and all the teachers are trained. And then you look at Sunday school, and it's like hum-de-dum-de-dum. and obviously I'm speaking generalities. There are some Sunday school presidencies that are totally on the ball, and not all guys are have those issues, but a lot of them do. And I frankly think that on the whole, women would likely do a superior job in Sunday school presidencies. I see no reason why they are a male-only thing. That has always, not always, but for a while has struck me as kind of a silly thing. All right, another one. And as I mentioned, some of these are not that significant. Others are more significant. Like one of them was my wife and a couple other gals were performing in church a couple months ago, and my wife was on the piano, and then a gal in our ward was on the cello, and then they brought in a gal on, I think, the violin. Yeah, the violin. And all three of them are like professional top notch. Like, this was something you would go to a concert and see, or pay money to go see. Like, I don't even remember what the song was, but it was beautiful. And it was so enjoyable, and just the emotion coming through the music, and it was just top notch. So they get done, and then they awkwardly go sit down. So the fact that we can't clap to some appropriate degree, to me, applause, like, it can obviously happen in excess, right, and be too rowdy. But it's so awkward to have something like that and not be able to show our support and our approval. And sure, you might say, oh, it'll chase away the spirit, or we need to be reverent. And it's like, well, moderation in all things. To everything, there's a time and a season. And I think, after an amazing performance like that, silence isn't always appropriate, I don't think. So to me, that's kind of a weird tradition. I get it. Again, we don't want people, standing ovation, and because it's not about them. It's about us. It's about the Spirit. It's about Jesus. So I get not wanting to focus attention on the people and giving them praise rather than giving God praise. But I think our applause, or if we want to snap our fingers like we're listening to poetry, I don't know what, but the silence is awkward, and I don't love that. Another one, in ward conferences, why is it now tradition, or it has been for years, at least in, I think, every ward I can remember being in, so I don't know if this is a global thing, maybe it's an American thing, where they say the number of active duty members of the military in the ward, right? It's always at the end. They get through the callings. Okay, the number of missionaries serving from the ward is 3, and the number of active duty members of the military is 2. It's like, what does that have to do with the church? What does that have to do with our ward conference? Like the number of doctors in the congregation is 4. The number of, electric engineers is 6. Like, someone chose the military as a profession. Why? And if you've read anything that I've written in like Christ versus Caesar or anything else, that how often I believe the military is itself an idol, and we're supposed to renounce war and all these things, right? So to me, it's always kind of odd that we're told how many people signed up for the military as their profession. I don't know why we do that. Another tradition I don't love is, and this one I believe is also in the handbook, that you're not supposed to or allowed to record in the chapel. Now, I get it when it comes to something like the sacrament. So with like a scalpel, focusing on like, do not record during, the administration of the sacrament. I don't have any problem with that, but to prohibit everything, like blessings, baby blessings, funerals that happen in the chapel, a choir performance. Like if my boy is giving his first talk in church, I can't record that just for our own like family archive. Or if my daughter is singing in the choir for some, primary song and it's super cute. I mean, again, like we don't want everyone just holding up their phones and turning into a congregation full of that. I get that. But like a hard ban on it, I don't know that I love. To me, there's like with the applause, there's perhaps an appropriate way to do this, or more like bumper guardrails to put around this, rather than just a full-on ban where people aren't able to do it. Because what did I do the other day? My boy was given bearing his testimony. I took a picture because it was the first time he's done that. Few months ago, I think, when they were doing a performance, I took a few seconds of video, and again, very discreetly or whatever, but like, I don't know. I don't think that's a sin. I don't think that's a problem. All right, the next one is this whole idea of using the sacrament with your right hand. We've like imbued symbolism into this that I don't think naturally exists, or that I understand at all. Of course, there's other things here. I remember when I was on my mission in Honduras, there was a big tradition where the deacons would like militaristically have their left arm behind their back and like against the flat of their like lower back. And so they would, without question, they would have their left hand there, and they would have the sacrament tray in their right hand, and they would walk around like that. And that was this weird kind of tradition. And from what I understood at the time, a lot of different Central or Latin American countries. But what matters is the sacrament. If I take it with my left hand, I don't think that really matters. It almost becomes a little pharisaical. Also, this idea that we should serve the bishop first, because he's there as kind of God's representative. To me, that's more of like a tradition and something that doesn't have inherent doctrinal justification. It's like this practice that has long been happening that we imbue with symbolic meaning. But is it really bad if a deacon just goes to serve the congregation and treats the bishop as an equal and all the other church leaders, and we don't have this like hierarchical, deferential kind of thing? We just recognize we're all equal before God, which leads me to the next silly tradition, and that is when someone is called into the bishopric or to be the bishop, it is packed in sacrament meeting. Why? Because all the family members and the cousins and the uncles and the grandma and everybody of these people come to church. If I was called into a bishopric, I don't know that I would tell my family, or if I did, I would not encourage them to come. We all concede, I think, that every calling is important. And who was it in the afternoon session today was talking about, I think it was Elder Uchtdorf, the hand and the arm and the eyes and the, feet, and we're all members of the body of Christ. So we have this acknowledgement that one calling is not better than the other or superior to another, that even primary teachers should be regarded with the same level of, respect or whatever. And yet we treat the bishopric with some kind of like pseudo celebrity status, where it's like, oh, we all got to come see this, we all got to be witnesses of this, we all got to come show our support, and we elevate that calling. But if callings are all equal, then I think we shouldn't be engaging in behavior like that and making a big show of that event in sacrament meeting. Similarly, another thing in sacrament meeting that I think is kind of a silly tradition is the Lion King-esque holding of the child that's just been blessed, and frankly, the entire baby blessing itself. We blessed both of our babies at home. That's allowed under the handbook, and a member of the bishopric comes over to be, witness to it, and we did it with our family in our home, and it was amazing. It was intimate. It was so meaningful, and I loved it. I'm so glad that we did that. And when I look at baby blessings in church, by contrast, it's, kind of noisy, and there's kids everywhere, saying stuff, and the deacon is there to shove the microphone in your face, and it's just this kind of like more formalized ritual in front of people who often you don't know 80% of them, and you're holding the Lion King baby up for display after for the very traditional, or even like, why can't moms be there to, hold their baby as the baby's being blessed? I think it would be far superior if families were encouraged to do baby blessings in the home, and that if there's some extenuating circumstance where that can't be the case, then certainly arrangements can be made to do it at church. But man, the level of intimacy and the spirit at doing it in our living room, in our home, on our timeline, just with our immediate family there who really cares about that baby, not random people who happen to just live down the street. I think that would be far better. Another thing with the church, what do you call it? Church meetings, is celebrating Mother's Day and Father's Day. Like, we go to church to focus on Christ, to take the sacrament, to be edified as members of Jesus's church, to come together as a community of Christ, to learn the doctrine, to worship together. I think Mother's Day and Father's Day, these made-up holidays, where so many wards will then assign all the talks on Mother's Day to be all about moms, or all the Father's Day talks to all be about dads, and then the Relief Society will create, root beer floats during the second hour for the men on Father's Day, or the Bishopric will have bought a bunch of like chocolate bars or whatever to distribute to the women on, yes, we want to acknowledge everyone. We want to support mothers and fathers. All of that is very well and good. But I think that should be outside of the church. Like, if you want to send ministers, whatever we call them now, ministers, the new home teachers, out door to door, if you want to send the deacons out when they do fast offerings to distribute something, I don't know. I don't know that I love going to church to just hear people share stories about their moms. I think church is and should be about so much more than holidays, which takes me to the next one, and that is singing patriotic songs in church. God Save the King, or Star Spangled Banner, or all these different, more political and civic songs, patriotic songs that I don't think should be sung in church. And I'm actually pleased that, from what I recall, the church is actually pulling those out of the upcoming hymnals that they're producing, ostensibly because, hey, look, now we're a much more international religion, and it doesn't make sense to have each country's, patriotic songs in the hymnal. Let's just have a more standardized thing. At least that's an argument. I don't know if that's ultimately the reason. I would hope that they would say, oh, it's because we want our hymns to actually focus on Jesus and not be, singing the Star Spangled Banner in the middle of sacrament meeting. Especially I don't love the tradition where everyone stands up to sing those patriotic hymns. Usually this is in a sacrament meeting around the 4th of July, and and people will all stand up. And for the past, several years, where whenever this has happened, I remain seated. I don't find it appropriate. I don't sing along, and I don't try to make a scene of it or anything. If anything, like once I think I left the chapel before they were singing the song. I don't want to make a deal about it, but you can feel like the lasers on your back when you're doing that, right? Because everyone else is standing up and they're singing and they're all, oh, yay, our country. And it's the similar stares I get when people see that I don't pledge allegiance to the flag. And that initial like, oh, are you not patriotic? And yet I'm like, I'm the most patriotic, freedom-loving person you'll ever meet, probably. But these rituals that everyone just is inculcated in from a young age, I question, and I try and be very intentional about what I do and what I don't do. Okay, last but not least, this one has been particularly irksome as a father. My wife fully agrees with this one. For years, we try to be very good with our kids' I guess diet, you would say. We're not like anti-sugar, but everything in moderation. We don't want our kids just, we don't feed them junk food and candy. And so we try and be very thoughtful about having a really good, diet and so forth. And so then you go to church and these church teachers, primary teachers, are sugaring these kids like crazy. I remember, what was it? It was, it's great to be 8. Here we are at this church event. I think it was for our daughter. And so it's like, oh, you're going to be baptized and let's learn all about it. And so it was Sunday night, I think. And so the parents and the kids were there. And so we get down there like, okay, we have a whole ice cream bar outside. Let's bless the refreshments, which I should count as its own silly tradition to bless completely unhealthy food and think that somehow does anything. But it's like this whole ice cream buffet with toppings and sprinkles and gummy bears and all this stuff. And it's like, why do we need that? All the time, kids go into primary and the teachers bring candy as a bribe. And to me, that speaks more to the fact that these are poor teachers who don't know how to maintain engagement with their kids. And so they want to bribe them into compliance. And the easiest way to do that is with sugar. So, as a parent, I don't love that because I don't want I don't want my kids to associate our faith with having to be bribed into, good compliance or that church is about that at all. I want my kids to be raised in and taught in an environment where they understand the actual ideas and are trying to gain a testimony and they focus on that. So this happens all over the place. I think that's just a broader cultural, it's a path of least resistance, It's easier to just incentivize or bribe a kid. And it happens just constantly. And frankly, I like that when we cut the 3 hours of church to 2, so that means the primary classes got cut in half. I think that makes it a little easier for teachers to feel like they can get by the whole time without it. I don't have any data to know if that's actually affected the propensity with which teachers are bringing candy to give out to kids, but I'd like to think that that might encourage some teachers to reconsider and be like, oh, it's only 30 minutes. I've got this, But it's this cultural crutch. And then, ward Halloween parties and Halloween itself, I just think it's, or even I remember going to parades here in Utah, it's a big kind of traditional thing, and Pioneer Day and 4th of July and whatever. And so they have all these parades. And I don't remember years ago this happening at all, but it's like within the past 5 or 10 years, all the people in the parade, the various cars and wagons or whatever, will bring bucket loads, big bags of candy, and they'll throw candy to the people on the side of the road. And so the kids are just going nuts, and they bring bags, and they're walking away from these parades with just sacks full of candy. And look, I don't like parades at all. I'm not saying that we should have, pure parades that don't require candy. I'm not a pro-parade person. I don't really like them. But I just find it silly that they have resorted to the same behavior, that they feel like they need to encourage engagement from the public. They want to draw families and kids there, and so they need to sugar them and bribe them. I don't think that is appropriate in church, and especially if kids have particular allergies, or if you have a parent who's trying to be, far less open with giving sugar to kids, I think it's disrespectful for teachers to just, do whatever they want and not be cognizant of those things. There have been cases in the past where we had teachers that were doing it, like giving out big bags of candy every week, and it was just getting ridiculous. So we'd go talk to the primary presidency and say, you need to put a stop to this. It's kind of ridiculous. It's one thing to hand out a tiny little fun size thing or, something small, but some of these teachers will just, I don't know if they're trying to be liked. They want the kids to like them or what, but that's a silly tradition. Okay, that's 16. I got all that off my chest. The old man yelled at the cloud. Again, this was a less substantive one, but I've had this list kind of developed and over time, and I was talking with my wife about several of these ideas. And again, like for me, this is mostly just interesting in the fact that, like, why do we do the things that we do? And I like questioning that. Some people just live their whole lives just accepting the status quo, and it is what it is, and they never question it. I like questioning. I like pondering. Why am I doing that? I like the intentionality of saying I want to focus my time and energy on the right things. And I'm not perfect at it by any means, but I kind of prefer that approach to trying to understand behavior and trying to make sure that my own behavior is appropriate or the best it can be or whatever. So as we think about broader church culture, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think some of the problem here is that you get those church statements from decades ago that never get superseded or overridden. And so we have this kind of cultural, not baggage, but like past stuff that just gets carried forward. And I don't know. I mean, we're not a perfect people, of course, by any means, and we shouldn't expect perfection, but I do think it's interesting to maybe call out some of these things and then identify where we can improve. I really think we need like public speaking 101. Of all these different things that I'm thinking about, I'm like that one I'm most latching on. I don't know what that would even look like, or even if it's just like, look, when you're giving a talk, don't launch into anything about yourself or the experience. Just begin with, I was an award, years ago, where they would actually give out speaking tips when they would give out the assignment. That's a cool idea, right? Here's a official letter that will send you or email you, and it's like, here's your topic, and please keep these tips in mind. That could be very effective, because it's not a one-time thing we hear in church about, hey, stop doing this, and then a bunch of people weren't there that day, they weren't paying attention at that time, they newly moved into the ward, so they never heard it a year later. That one and done, I think, wouldn't work. But yeah, whenever a talk is given, to have like a public speaking 101 sheet that is given to that person, that could make a lot of change. So this is all, if Connor was a bishop, then what changes would be made in his congregation, and encouraging families to, hey, did you know that you can bless your baby at home? Me or my counselor would love to come over, and if you want that more, even just making people aware that some of this stuff is out there. So, all right, we'll wrap it there. Gonna go have lunch before we continue our binge watching of General Conference. SundayMusings.org. If you aren't aware of that, that's where I now compile all of these, and you can search by keyword and find any past ones that you want. Thanks for indulging me in a little more of a silly Sunday musing. Next week's is substantive, so we'll see you in a week.